Dub poster session. And again, both these events are open to both audiences, so Dub folks can stay for the video session, and MobiSys folks can go to the Dub poster session. And after that, we will run a joint paper session that has 2 papers from MobiSys, 2 papers from Dub. And these papers were selected primarily based on broad relevance to both audiences, so that should make for a very exciting mixed program. And again, please take that opportunity to mingle and get to know folks from the other community. With that, I'll let Krishna introduce our keynote speaker.
Just a clarification, I'm not a keynote speaker. So it's my Thank you. It's my distinct privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Professor Deborah Esrin. Deborah is a professor in computer science at Cornell Tech in New York City, where she founded the Jacobs Institute for Health Technology Development. She leads the Small Data Lab that focuses on the the pervasiveness of mobile devices and our ability to use these devices to gather data about our daily interactions for health and life management. She also co-founded a non-profit startup which works with clinical experts, app and device developers to make this digital health data useful and actionable. Now, prior to that, Deborah was a faculty member at UCLA, where she did some really pioneering research in the development of mobile and wireless networking systems, protocols, and architectures to collect and analyze data in real time about the physical world. In fact, her research led to this whole establishment of this area of sensor networks as an interesting academic discipline. Deborah has many distinctions and recognitions. She's a fellow of ACM, fellow of IEEE. She's also an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a National Academy of Engineering, and she won several awards like ACM Medina Lecturer Award and Federal Institute's Women of Mission Award, and so on. I'd like to just conclude this with just an interesting tidbit that I discovered about Deborah. She comes from a family of several pioneering and visionary CS computer science researchers. In fact, the one thing that I found digging up Google Scholar was that Deborah's mother, Thelma Esrin, she was a professor of computer science, and she was actually one of the first people to apply computer science technology to healthcare and medical research. And she wrote papers titled A Data-Driven Medical Decision-Making Aid in the 1970s and 80s. That's just ridiculously visionary. So with that, I would like to, without further ado,
started me off tearing up. I won't do it. I did it at Grace Hopper, if any of you happen to have been there. When my mother passed away, she had dementia for a number of years, but when she passed away a year ago, February, I looked through a bunch of her letters. This is not part of my talk. And I found some of these documents. I mean, I knew she had done that work, but when I looked at the invitations for her to give talks about the application of computing to brain science and saw the date was 1966. It was pretty crazy. She also wrote stuff about women in engineering that was also completely, unfortunately, ahead and behind its time, and everything she wrote is still ridiculously applicable today. Okay, on to my talk. Thank you so much for inviting me, as I've told some of you. I've been wanting to come to a Dub conference for quite a while, and as each year would roll around and so many obligations, I never actually got around to it. And I really enjoyed being here the last couple of days and seeing the diversity in the technical community. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. So, I want to talk about what I came to call small data. It's not an attitudinal thing. It's not that I don't think big data is important. I do. It's just a different perspective on how we might use all the data that's being generated. So sometimes I refer to this as N equals me data that comes from a lot of focus on health applications. But what I'm going to talk about today starts to span out and extend beyond health. And maybe just to begin with, I think it's relevant to sort of say a little bit academically where I came from, since I don't know, well, the MobiSys people in the audience, I know many of you, but the WWW people in the audience, not particularly, and I just want to give you a little sense of where I come from. So sort of from an N equals me perspective, I grew up in LA. That, I don't know if any of you recognize that picture, but that's Gloria Steinem. So I was elected Gloria Steinem of my graduating high school class. And so went to Berkeley as an activist, MIT grad school. Most importantly, I spent a lot of time in my formative career years in the IETF. Very actively involved in protocol definition in early days of the internet, and most of my time I spent at ISI in John Postel's group while I was a faculty member, but hung out mostly in the marina. I then started doing work in sensor networks and moved to UCLA and had the great opportunity to run an NSF center that brought together ecologists and environmental engineers in the development of environmental sensing systems. And that's when I sort of made this switch from doing things that were entirely somewhat lower level architectural or protocol based to actually engaging with applications. When I was down here in the lower left corner and mostly at sitcoms and IETFs, the only people who sort of did applications were people who couldn't really design protocols, was the perspective at the time. And we used to accept some application papers, sort of like an affirmative action measure. And that's sort of how I was raised. You did stuff low enough down that it was generic and general purpose and you weren't tied to particular applications. But as I started doing distributed sensing, we realized that to sense without knowing what you're using the data for doesn't make much sense, and you really needed to close that loop because the temperature and light levels on a ceiling of a room such as this is very different from what you need to understand about light levels and temperature on the surface of leaves to try to understand something about ecosystems. So context really mattered, the real application matters, and that. So I just went over that ledge and have not come back from it in terms of being very engaged with applications in that context. Somewhere in the middle of this process, mobile phones started getting really interesting, programmable, and having lots of devices on them. And so started looking at these things as distributed sensors and did things like participatory sensing, which ended up wandering through that into health applications because these things were on these things, and health is one of the most interesting issues that individuals deal with. Got really interested, that's getting really faint, but got very interested in passive data that these things could generate, more and more engaged in health, and eventually now I'm in New York City at Cornell Tech. This is not a picture of New York City, but it feels, sometimes New York City feels that way. And just since I always forget to get to this at the end, I want to say at the beginning that obviously this is work done with a bunch of other people as we were growing what's going on at Cornell Tech. Great collaborators, and I'll come back to that later if I have time. So, small data. All I mean by small data are, whereas big data is usually about looking at things across a large N, across your users, across your customers, across your patients. Small data, I just mean looking at the multiple traces and sources of data about an individual. And doing that from the perspective of trying to build tools that service them. So small data is to individuals what big data is to institutions or to services that are trying to serve many. It's just business analytics for the individual. And it's been called many other things. I was giving a TED-Med talk and preparing it in 2013, and the TED-Medders had said I can't use all these various terms of personal data, and they stuck me with small data, and that's what I've been stuck with since then. So it started out, and I'll say more about this, with data that comes from mobile devices that everyone now carries around with them. So think about passively collected activity and location traces that you can download an app and do this. That is now done routinely, but it extends beyond that to purchases. Our consumer transactions are small data about us over time. Where we spend our money, where we spend our time, email communications, was a great talk by some young folks yesterday around this. Our calendar items, and many other sources of our activities on the web, obviously search and such, that in that trace is a lot of information about me, particularly when I think about how it might, not so much from a diagnostic perspective to somehow classify me or categorize me or diagnose me, but to look at changes over time. So the potential for the power of that small data in this perspective of the individual as the nexus of control is to be able to get the data from multiple providers, pre-process, normalize, extract it, and enable small data-fueled applications. So this really isn't a world of quantified self that I'm talking about, although thank you all the quantified selfers out there who have been the vanguards of this sort of a thing. But most people don't have time to spend time looking at their data, analyzing it with R, Python, or whatever might be your tools of preference. Most people do have smartphones and download apps. And so I think about this as a new class of applications, or just an old class of applications, but can now be personalized and fueled for me through my small data streams, I process small data streams. So to sort of, somebody was giving a talk in the entrepreneurial track yesterday, right? Say the conclusion at the beginning. This is something like Ginger.io meets Google Now, right? Nothing particularly new, except we should have as many of those applications as there are mobile apps. We should be designing all kinds of niche and micro-channel applications for particular purposes that allow people to personalize them through their small data streams. So some example of these small data-fueled applications that we've explored, different levels of maturity, things around personalized healthcare, personalized treatment, titrating medications, how am I doing in response to particular medication and self-care, looking at some things upstream of health, if you will, in the prevention domain. I'll give an example of each of these. Improved household, creating improved household food environments, and also detecting progression of cognitive impairment. So one thing I want to say before proceeding is one of the things that interests me around small data apps is that they scale down. They scale up, right, but they scale down. That interests me as a somewhat odd academic. I'm in academia. In January, I've been obsessed about this. In January, I will have been a faculty member for 30 years, which is crazy. But as an academic, I need to be able to do things that don't require me to have huge penetration and huge success in order to get value. Small data applications have utility without having a large user base, initially. They're not necessarily about discovery initially. You know what you're looking for, and the small data gives you ability to monitor that passively and automatically and continuously in a way that you didn't have before. Because you're not so much looking to diagnose or across individuals as you're trying to look for in-person variation. And that means that initially you can go ahead and pursue these things in the way that mobile apps have evolved. Like way too many of them and lack of control, and most of them are garbage, yes. But there's fast churn. And on the other hand, it also means that it's not necessarily the material that venture capitalists love. In the small, it's not necessarily about massive growth, but there's a lot of opportunity for iteration. So yes, and over time, as we have more of these small data apps, we will have more small data across large and there'll be a lot of stuff we can discover. But initially, as I'm not talking about doing things really for discovery of some unknown correlation. I'm talking about what you know you want to be measuring, and now the ability for individuals to maybe discover something about themselves and the relationship between things, but we can design the analytics even without a large N. Heresy. Okay, so really began with the health as the killer app, because health is a context in which the individual is taking care of themselves, maybe it's their family members, but the individual is doing self-care, you're giving a medication, and you're told take as needed. When you think about pain meds in particular, that's a really slippery slope and hard to know when is as needed. When you look at all the stuff that people buy in terms of nutritional supplements, whether it's ginkgo biloba for focus or glucosamine for joints or probiotics for emotional health or gut health, is that particular thing working for me? Am I taking it below effective dose, way above effective dose? Many things that people take care of themselves. And then of course there's the clinical care. And when you go into a clinician, they've given you a prescription, whether it's for antidepressants or anti-anxiety or for migraines, it's a titration process. There's not they start their range of initial medications and some suggested dosing levels that might have to do with your age and height and weight and such, but then it's a titration process. They start conservatively, and then they increase to try to get effective dose. To me, it's like TCP congestion control, right? And where is the feedback though? They don't do it by detecting drug packets. Okay, I'll stop with the networking analogies. They do it by asking you, how are you feeling? Sometimes there's a blood test. So you're doing it for cholesterol control, you can check it in a blood test. Blood pressure, you have it. Migraine, pain, anxiety, depression, many other conditions, there is no existing blood test that they can do to close that feedback loop. So it's retrospective self-report. And the data that we all generate now can have us do much better than that. So we use passively recorded activity and location that I mentioned, mobile apps, some of which include interesting forms of self-report, and of course real sensors too. But these things evolve slowly, and many of them that evolve more quickly are less useful than you might want. But some of them are quite interesting, like this. What used to be called, it's now called Propeller Health, where they put something on the inhaler of kids so that they can actually tell how frequently they're using their asthma inhaler. Increasingly, this is what I want to be talking about, are these other digital traces we generate that I think are as important, as relevant, as telling, and clearly much more available already than continuous measurements from physiological sensors. So consumer transactions, email, Netflix binging, all sorts of things that are relevant to our daily patterns. So consumer transactions are really quite interesting. Most of what you can get from consumer transactions most easily, though, are not at the item level. It's largely when we buy things at bricks and mortar, even if we buy it with a credit card, it's largely at the vendor level. Now, at the vendor level, if it's a cafe versus in a restaurant, that is already pretty specific, but in many contexts, such as grocery shopping, it doesn't really give us the information that we'd like. So where we've begun to explore this is in the context of online grocery shopping. So Pushcart is a prototype project we have exploring this context of using small data and closing a feedback loop of health. And what Pushcart does is, if you do online grocery shopping, I have no idea how popular that is in Europe. It's growing in popularity in the US. And when you sign up with Pushcart, you then use your Pushcart email address to get your receipts from online shopping. And in the US, in places like Peapod and Instacart and FreshDirect and Amazon Fresh and a growing number of these things, and Seamless, which is where people order their takeout from restaurants. And we automatically, you don't have to remember to forward it, you don't have to remember to log anything, we automatically get your email receipts from all your purchases, and we parse them, and we call out to nutritional APIs that exist out there to classify the nutritional contents of your grocery cart. And then we're able to give feedback week by week, both to the individual, but more importantly, to what are initially sort of Wizard of Oz coaches on health. And they can look at, from a week-to-week basis, and send swap suggestions These will ultimately be automated, but not yet. And they send swap suggestions for swapping out strawberries for the strawberry ice cream, kind of a thing, depending on what your health goals are. What's interesting about it is that it's the kind of thing that can stay with you, and as we all sort of try to create better habits, one of the things that is very common is things happen, we travel, things happen in the family, various crises, the holidays, and our habits sort of slip off the wagon, and because this is all passive, the data analysis and the prompting can pop back in to suggest that healthier composition of the grocery cart that you had achieved months ago, and suggest the baby steps to get back towards that. So that's just a simple example of using your small data trace to influence your behavior in a closed loop way, as opposed to somebody just giving you guidance on what you should do without ever being able to see what you actually do. In this case, when a swap is suggested, a person can also see if you don't do it, because a suggestion that you're not going to do isn't very useful, and can suggest an alternative one instead. And we're starting to build the tools for the Wizard of Oz's behind the curtain to be able to look at swap suggestions and which ones seem to be stickier than others. So what got me started with small data was actually experiencing, before my mother passed away, my father passed away in 2012, I think, yes. And he was a professor of computer science at UCLA. My mother was later given that degree. She was that story of a PhD in electrical engineering the same time as my father, but was always on soft money. And so let us be aware of these things in our institutions. In any case, back on topic, when my father passed away, he'd been an incredibly good, really had been my mother's primary caregiver up through the age of 90. And he suddenly started failing in health, and we didn't understand what was going on. And when we took him to the doctor, they didn't understand either. And in fact, in the emergency room when I took him shortly before he passed, the emergency room doctor clearly thought I was just a neurotic daughter, and that he looked to him like a very normal 9-year-old. He presented like an average 9-year-old. Of course, this doctor hadn't seen my father a month before. And a month before, he wasn't an average 9-year-old. Now, there was nothing to be done. It was the end of his time. He had an incredibly fortunate and rich life. But that not understanding and not being able to see somebody relative to what they were and how they had been and how their function had been had nothing to do with anything you could physiologically measure. Just started me thinking a lot more about this mobile health things in the context of people who weren't necessarily native mobile. And a short time after that, I had an email and started to have a communication with a woman I still have not met in person named Gert, who had read some things about mobile health and was talking about her generation that didn't really download apps, they weren't particularly on Facebook, but she really had a sense that she wanted to be able to keep a kind of tabs without being tracked, and to have some of her close friends be able to get a sense of how she was doing overall, to notice when she maybe would go into a decline. And so one of the things we started to design based on that was a notion of something that would let you sort of share how you're doing without sharing what you're doing. So as an example of something that would take these passive data streams that are very intimate, very, very telling, and really too much information to share. Too much for the individual to necessarily be comfortable sharing generally, and also just too much information for the other person. Whether that other person is a family member or a clinician, certainly too much information for clinicians. Clinicians are too busy and are too regimented in their practice now to have the time to deal with lots of data. It has to come to them as a relevant piece of information already synthesized down. So Aura is this example of an application that takes a range of inputs, pulls out some pattern extraction really just to look at you relative to your normal. And to give the sense to a small number of others, how are you doing relative to your normal? Not how are you doing relative to your neighbor, just how are you doing relative to your normal. And in doing that, I started thinking more about these communication patterns as intelligent traits. That was one of the things about my father, I realized that he had stopped sending email. Now again, if you told most people that your 9-year-old father had stopped sending email, they will look at you askance, okay? But my father was in the original round of people who were using the ARPANET. He had hired Glenn Kleinrock, and that first note on the internet talking to SRI was done at UCLA. And so he was a long-time email user, and he always answered his daughters and his grandchildren's emails promptly, thoroughly, thoughtfully, for those of you who knew him. So looking at that email as a data trace, and not just at the timing of it, and we heard some of this yesterday in that Yahoo talk. If you're out here, I really want to talk to whoever gave that paper. But also in the language itself. So something we just started doing is looking at email and language use as an indication of cognitive function. So what's also exciting about being able to do this is that for those of us who don't live in places like Google or Yahoo or other ones where you're service providers and you have access to lots of data, when we have started up in mobile health applications, we have to get people now prospectively using the passive data tracing things that we do. But with email, and thanks to things like the great Gmail API and such, if you engage somebody as a participant in your study and they agree to give you access to their Gmail, you can go retrospectively and do language analysis over their email trace, as was in the paper yesterday. So we are starting to get together participants under IRB to do longitudinal analysis over the language traces, over the language patterns they use in their email. Now we don't know exactly what to look for yet. And as was described yesterday, you have to figure out, if you look at certain dyads of communication where you've had ongoing communication, do you look at communications that are long enough? What are you looking for in those language features? There certainly is enough literature existing around how language declines, and looking at linguistic diversity and some grammatical issues. But this is interesting not just for cognitive impairment, but also for things like brain fog and cognitive fatigue that in many conditions people complain about, whether it's something that's as a result of chemotherapy or a side effect of medications, or many in the Lyme disease community, that's an issue for them. So this is a really interesting, rich data source that I'm sure as a community we will come up with the right set of pre-processing and that needs to happen in order to find the signal amidst all the noise in that communication. So beyond health, we're starting to look at this also in things that come more to what people in the .gov community more traditionally look at. So the opportunity to take recommendation and personalization even more personal and about that individual. And so starting to look at if somebody is amenable to having their personal, not just social media, which is public, but their personal communication, be mined for topic interest and such, or even locations, travel patterns as being things that are very relevant to things I might be interested in. So I have a student who's looking at personalizing news feeds based on Gmail, YouTube, and Twitter data streams, and looking at, from the get-go, like falling off a log, it clearly helps the cold start problem, and how much it helps later on is still under investigation. So, I mean, in some sense, I can't talk about this stuff without talking about Google Now. Google Now is a really interesting example of a small data application. How many of you use Google Now? So it's been around for a while, but it's gotten more and more interesting in what it reminds you about and what it tells you about, such as what it expects you to be going to the airport, how long it will take you to get there, and things like that. It is personal. It is based on my personal patterns, and in some sense, all I'm hoping that we can do together is to engage in a lot more small data application development. It shouldn't just be Google doing it for the Google users at large. That there are many specialized ways in which these data can be useful, and that same sort of a thing can be useful in individuals. So let me also say that I think there's a beyond me. There's this an interesting way of sharing small data within communities and groups. Some of it might be around transparency. We started having a conversation with Jen Mankoff from CMU last week and talking about her great work going on with tenants, sharing information about landlords and housing conditions and things. But if you thought about what the actual utility cost is of living in an apartment, how do you know, right? It has to do with how leaky are the windows and things like that. But if as apartment dwellers, right, people were able to just donate their traces of utility bills, it just is as an example of how being able to share your individual data as a member of a community could be relevant. Certainly for feedback, I think it's interesting to look at student engagement or lack thereof with instructors or with tutors or with family members or with themselves. Now that we have so much more learning happening online, there's interesting ways of helping people sort of look at when their best semester was and what those patterns were, when should they be starting that homework assignment, and helping to close the loop between people who are helping students learn and the students themselves. And coordination, so whether it's, if you think about using Slack as well as an input into some of these data streams, but also having a sense of how interruptible or busy, or sort of where are your colleagues with respect to flow? Is this a good time to interrupt them or not? Among collaborators, there are just many ways in which in small groups having this shared data might lead to interesting applications. Okay, so what about the P word? So 2 years ago in the summer, I was at a workshop at Dodgeville, and it was all about the P word. And I gave a talk, and I wasn't exactly tarred and feathered, but I was kicked out as an American imperialist, which is not sort of where I'm used to being placed on whatever political spectrum. But I just decided I was not going to say the full P word again as an American in Europe. So, but what about it? So I don't have answers here, but there are some things that do motivate me in this work. One is, but instead of making it as a statement, I'm going to hide behind a question mark. Okay, so these are hiding behind the question mark. So is it less creepy when we're cognizant of the data that we generate? So not just that we consent, but if we start to use applications that use that data for us, and we're more cognizant of that data being collected, then lots of things that surprise lots of people wouldn't actually surprise them. Is it creepy when you know what's going on? And is there utility in an individual sort of having a say, choosing applications over access to their aggregated data streams beyond what just Google knows or what just Amazon knows or what just Facebook knows, or, okay, maybe there's nothing left after those three, but Verizon, okay. Is there utility in having a say over what happens to the aggregate of those data streams, even if I don't, over what goes on within each platform? Remember, these are statements, I'm hiding behind the question mark. And can we sort of have our cake and eat it too? Now, I would like an Italian in the audience to please laugh at this last line. If you don't laugh, I'm very disappointed. So I was putting up this have your cake and eat it too, because in some sense, there's something about these small data apps that somehow I have this idealistic or imperialistic, whatever, hope that we can not fight necessarily the battle of the data that's captured about us, but if we can use that data that's captured about us, that it will balance things out in some way. So I went to Wikipedia and looked up have your cake and eat it too in Italian, because I thought it would be funny to put it up in Italian. But then, anyway, go to Wikipedia and look up how you say have your cake and eat it too in Italian. So there are challenges here, right? I have had some great conversations with Helen Nissenbaum about this question, and I try never to use the term ownership with respect to it. I'm not saying we own this data, and I haven't really referred to any new data collection. Most of the data that I think is interesting to use in this context of building these small data apps is already collected by somebody else. I clearly don't solely own it. Ownership is just unclear, and it's probably just the wrong term. There are challenges of actually incentivizing services to make that data available to the subscriber, but Google, for example, has some great APIs that are very rich, and they do it for whatever reason. I think that that's something that if we create the apps, the APIs will follow. So making selective sharing intuitive, embodied applications, I don't know, 10 years ago when we started looking at this stuff, we were looking at, particularly it was all about location traces. And how would you let people selectively share their location traces? But it's just too much work, as with most other things having to do with privacy and security. But within applications, if you build applications that that make it clear that their semantics is to share how they're doing, for example, as opposed to what they're doing. If we build apps that is the nature of those apps and it's intuitive to the user, maybe there's something there in helping us with this governance. But it's really important to take care of the security of that data wherever we do it. Because the one thing about it is not anonymized. Its whole utility derives from its lack of anonymity. It's about me. So as I bring it together, it puts me at risk. We really have to have the infrastructure to protect it. So to create this kind of a socio-technical architecture for small data, it's about these personal data APIs, with the biggest challenge being incentivizing service providers. I should add that it's interesting that even in regulated industries, telephone, banking, that are highly regulated in terms of third-party use of that data, they are allowed to give the data back to the subscriber. So it's somewhat regulation compatible, this idea of having personal data APIs. Because your bank does not freely give out your banking information to third-party use, but they can give it to you, and the same for your cellular provider. But we have to figure out how to create the structures that will let these small data apps evolve in some context without putting the individual at risk. Because for the most part, the third-party services work really hard, even though they don't always succeed. They work really hard to protect your data. They are highly incentivized to have good security. And when you start to decentralize and have, as many personal data apps as you have apps on your phone, we open up a lot of potential risk. I don't think it's unsolvable, but we have to address it. So my hope is that we can build a modular architecture, at least. It doesn't have to be a single platform, or it has to not be a single platform, in which we can connect, build modular analytics that we can share and reuse to drive applications in this space. So if I can sort of end with what this ecosystem might look like, and that's sort of why I'm here. I'm looking for fellow travelers, if you will, that it's about creating modular APIs to access data from popular apps and services, simple storage patterns, and more importantly, the data processing that is going to process that linked data. It's not about bringing your data into a honeypot of stored data. This is really all about linked data, that as you need it, you're processing it, and you are perhaps storing inferred information. Having a community in which we're sharing that reusable data, analytics, visualizations, and where we're building lots of very specific micro-channel applications tailored to very specific use cases that scale down, not only up. So you can do things in this context that don't work for the whole population, but that work for a niche population, because it is going to help an individual at a time. If only one person uses that small data application, they already get benefit from it because it isn't so much a network effect. Context, it's about looking for changes over time and closing their feedback loops, whether it's about health or productivity or social or something more entertainment-based. And then building up the consumer developer research communities around these building blocks. So that's why I'm here, aside from the fact that you invited me. I have this small data lab at Cornell Tech with some funders listed there, always important. And then I just need a moment to say, Cornell Tech, small startup campus in New York City. We're currently very grateful for being incubating inside the Google building, not inside Google, inside the Google building in Chelsea. In 2 years, we'll be moving to Roosevelt Island. We're hiring, recruiting students, and please come by and visit.
We have time for questions. I guess there are microphones here that can be circulated out.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Did I sense correctly that you moved away from concept we talked about in the past of a personal data store? You bring it all together. Your last slide seems to imply you're moving away from that. Did I get that right?
So a personal data store has worries me because it's a store and it's a honeypot. But that there will be services that let you bring your data streams together for processing and fusing. Yes, the notion of calling it a personal data vault or store, I have moved away from because I got lots of, I think, correct feedback about the notion that it's not necessarily a store. But there need to be places where you can run these apps, and I don't know where those are going to be. But the notion that we can build these apps independent of where they are, and they might be run by your bank or personal.com or Google or who knows where. I'm more interested in the utility and having it happen and let those data processing elements operate where they may.
Thanks for a really great keynote. Robert Lee from Rice University. I believe in your vision. I really liked it. I have a question about these longitudinal studies, especially with language on the web. I see things changing a lot, right? We used to have AIM, MySpace, Facebook, Twitter. Things have changed really rapidly. Can you comment a little bit on your experiences on dealing with that rapid change?
I agree with you, and I don't have any experience with it, in the sense that the demographic, so right now we're looking at email traces from people who are significantly older and probably didn't use messaging applications so much. They use text messaging with their grandkids. But right now we're looking at longer communications that happen in email, so that work that's longitudinal based on language is within that channel. With respect to shorter messaging, that is probably a better thing to use with respect to sentiment analysis and mood and things around depression or anger or what have you in that context that you would be more able to find in shorter text communication. And it's interesting, just like people worried about that we used to store things in my day on floppy disks, right? And that the storage mediums, you can't even find something that would read a floppy disk. That same problem as we have churn in our communication platforms, how are we going to cope with that? Hadn't thought about it until you just mentioned it. Because the context of where we look at anything that's more around sentiment is shorter time frame, isn't as long-term and historical. So interesting question that I hadn't thought about.
Yep. Pablo Rodriguez from California. I guess you mentioned that the value of all these personal data space is in bringing all these data sources together from multiple places that are mostly not in silos, and that you need to bring them in one place to create your personal data soul, your identity, your digital you. Now, the issue is that all these data, all this personal data is stored in these silos because a lot of that data is being sold as a product to third parties. And now what you want to do is you want to turn customers from users from being products to being customers. And I'm wondering whether there is an innovator dilemma there in how do you incentivize all these third parties to open their API. We've seen APIs being closed. So what is the incentive there?
So, yes. So I tried to preempt your question, but I'm glad you asked it because it is an issue, right? In that, how do you incentivize that? So first of all, that's another one of these have your cake and eat it too. In the sense that, yes, if you give your subscriber back their individual data stream, that is not preventing you as Telefonica or anybody else from selling aggregated, semi-sanitized, whatever data to third parties, right? The work that would be needed to go around to all of your subscribers and get them to give back their data to that third party, I guess there's a scenario there in which it could threaten the model. It just doesn't seem like, and you know, the granularity of that data that you might share, that seems possibly a threat, but it just doesn't seem very convincing to me. And there are even in some contexts, and even a legal right of your subscriber from billing perspectives and other things to be able to get that data back. So I don't see this tiny trickle per subscriber, right, as being a threat to third-party models. So that it would be a threat to an existing business model, I don't buy, but talk to me and I'll back off of it the way I back off other things once people yell at me about them. But that's different from incentivizing people to actually do it. So the incentive to do it, I don't know, Google's doing it, I don't know what their incentive is for doing it, right? It does in some sense encourage things to be built on top of your platform, maybe it's that others do it and therefore you will too. That one, it's a little bit like the street artist who, you know, tells everyone standing around to start clapping even before they started performing so that it builds an audience and they can start performing. So I agree with that, and I would look to all ideas or suggestions about where we can start incentivizing that. But I don't think it's a threat to the business model of third-party data. Maybe it would be good if it was, but I don't think it is.
Yeah, that was great talk. Nigel Shabot, University of Southampton. I'm interested in just pressing you a bit on the surrender of the term personal data store. I think it's there's something about the empowerment of the individual citizen or consumer around the sense of taking responsibility as well as having rights in their data. And I'm just wondering whether, just push it down a little bit, and whether there's architectures that we need to help support that. And it's not a one-size-fits-all, it's just that.
I agree, and really, Ramon, I didn't intend to not include it. I don't know, it's just sort of, it slipped away from me in terms of being an essential part of it, maybe because I just don't know where it will happen. But I think it's certainly an interesting thing to happen. I just don't know that it has to happen. You can build small data apps even if that begins to be a style of an app that sits in a larger provider. But yes, it's even more interesting if there are secure, encrypted, private containers in the cloud where people can run their small data apps in the way that we run our mobile apps here. It's just that I used to be able to say with more ignorance, perhaps, that this is private to me, but it really isn't. So, and the perception of private versus clear that isn't, but yes, I think that's a really interesting model as well.
Yeah, thank you for an interesting talk. I have two questions. The first question is, what do you feel about the mobile advertisement app? Do you think that is a small data application? And the second question is, do you think that the future development of the small data application should be all in the offline mode and the online mode, which the application can be run independently on the mobile devices without connection to the cloud?
So the second question is easier for me to answer. So I never thought of cloud as necessarily being offline, but off mobile. So these things fall in toilets, right? So I don't consider this a place to uniquely store anything, right? Everything I have here and a lot of processing is more interestingly done, perhaps in a historical context. So it might be that my daily movements or my language use or my level of raspiness in my voice if I have allergies is something I want to compare to what it was last year at this season of the year, and that's not necessarily going to be on this phone. So this is a cache for things that exist in the cloud. And that's what you mean by offline. It's not offline, it's just off mobile. And so that, definitely. Advertising as a small data app. So if what you mean is sort of recommender, very personalized recommender systems in advertising, then yes. Although I just think there are enough people working on advertising and I don't need to do that too. But yes, in fact, I do think it's interesting for people who already know and are working on advertising to think about, this sort of thing as well.
I'm Pete from University of Southampton. Brilliant talk. I love the vision. It's really cool. Two quick questions. One, do you get pushback from clinicians who are worried about people misinterpreting, or especially coming from people who have a new condition and don't know what to do? And the second question is, the world of one is statistically very lonely. And have you explicitly addressed the problem of sparsity in some of your models? You have so many cool models here.
I love that. Distracted. Okay, so clinicians and pushback. So I don't do anything in health without sort of a clinician in the collaboration. Aside from the fact that my eldest sister is a real doctor, and clinicians have lots of pushback, mostly having to do with the fact that has to do with their care. They can't deal with information that they don't know what to do with, that isn't robust, that isn't telling them something. So that's where the greater part of that information is. I try to disclaim over and over again, this is not diagnostic. And so I don't even touch that really. It's for somebody who's been diagnosed and is trying to do self-care, and you're trying to get a better personalized sense of how they're responding to a medication or a treatment plan or physical therapy, or are they doing their physical therapy? Where I come in, and so then it's not in that loop of all that concern that doctors have about people coming in with so much information, from the web or 23andMe or patients like me or whatever, whatever those very useful tools are. And really, the newer generations of clinicians, because I get to work with medical students and to residents and onwards through my medical school connection, it's really changing quite a bit in terms of that very reactive notion of that. So thank you for the second question. How do we even build our models in terms of detecting change? There's a lot of noisiness in this. And yes, you don't do that from an N of 1. You use it as an N of 1, but you have a modest size. And that's how we build activity classifiers. And when we're looking at even trying to understand what's the processing pipeline for taking somebody's corpus of email communications and pulling out of it some relevant signal, we do that from some modest size number of early participants for whom you have corresponding clinical or life event information that you can iterate a lot with and develop those models. I'm just trying to say that for the most part, we're starting with looking for things that the clinicians or the expert already know to look for. We're not in the mode of discovering things that we have no idea what to look for. That will come, but the point is that there's great utility to individuals even without that. So, thank you for that question.
Robin Kravitz, University of Illinois. I won't use the P word, but we know that as the generations change, but also as we age, we have different opinions about what we are willing to expose about information. So, it's well known that elderly people won't tell their caretakers that they've fallen. And so it's not only the generations that we are, and the young kids won't tell anybody anything. Have you seen any interesting trends that span the generation and age that change things over time?
I think there are other people in this audience who would better be able to answer that than I will. I would give my, I think your comments are perfectly apt in that notion of with elders and people who are being cared for, some tend in the opposite direction of very much, it's not that they're exaggerating, it's that they remember so vividly the bad that seems to predominate their experience. This happens a lot in Crohn's disease and other things that, one bad day in a month is, I know this from working with clinicians and GI clinicians, will tend to have people self-report that their whole week or month has been bad because it's such a traumatic bad experience to have that happen. Whereas others will tend to downplay events that they're a little scared of what the implications might be of them. We all do this. It is very natural to worry ahead what might be the implication. Somebody's going to that's not my alarm, but it would be embarrassing if it is. People worry about the consequences of what they're going to say. Now, at some level, it should be to somebody's, if they want to. I'm not interested in keeping people from lying to other people. First of all, it's too hard. If somebody wants to lie, they will. And I don't know how to build things that will get around people lying. But I am interested in these data streams to help keep people from lying to themselves. So I think that's the right mode to think about it, is to let people be clearer about what they are and are not doing. Are you really doing those stretching exercises for your lower back that might keep you from having to take addictive opiate-based pain medication or have to have back surgery because you can get to a point of it being a tolerable level of pain, right? Did you do your back exercise this morning? It's not something we necessarily lie to somebody else about, but it's easy to lie to yourself about it. Or how many times this week did you do it? So, but in terms of a cross-generation, young people also like to keep information from their parents. And I really think it's, as somebody said yesterday or the day before, it's about at different stages of life, there's different types of information that you selectively share and that you feel are appropriate to share in different contexts. And that just doesn't seem to me to be changing very much, but that's not an academic scholarly answer, that's just an intuitive.
I would like to ask if it's very inspiring, this talk, and I would like to ask if you see some business models for this to happen.
Yeah. So I see business models, whether I see startup scale business models, that's not as much, not as clear. So, but also possible. So that you could build something that would be useful and that people would pay for and that would generate revenue beyond initial developers, that old notion of small business, but that now in the age of the internet could be, globally relevant, but to a small community. Definitely. From examples like even Pushcart, there are some students who are taking it out as a startup called Epicure, the online grocery shopping, right? That is something of great interest to insurance providers in the US, which ironically are the ones that care about people not getting as sick, and employer wellness programs and things like that. They do all kinds of things because of the trends of poor nutrition, obesity, leading to diabetes and lots of other conditions. There's a lot of interest in investment in those things. It's very difficult to know what to do. There are there are definitely business models, certainly in that healthcare space, where more effective personalized care. The same is true abuse and overuse and dependence and overprescription, not to put it on the patient, but to put it on the clinicians who started this mess of opiate-based pain med addiction. In the US, it's an unbelievable epidemic of people who were given pain medication, which turns out to be very addictive, and then you have to take more and more to get the same effectiveness, and eventually it doesn't work at all. That problem and helping people find other behavioral paths that might come through small database. If you think about a a physical therapy coach instead of the nutritionist, and the data being about movement instead of about what you purchase. There are definitely business models in that mode. Business models that have scalability at the scale of VCs and startups, that probably has to get again in a data play. And probably even there are things, right? Nielsen and all that they know about consumers and sampling that they do, these are incredible contexts in which to be able to have pretty individualized and feedback and be able to do, specific experiments on in the context of that data and that feedback information. So there is probably a big data thing once you get big as well. But again, what interests me is that I think there are solid, old school business models, revenue producing can more than support their development, that happen in microchannels, and business models of both individuals, but even more so, various entities will pick.
I guess this will take the final question and then wrap up. Thank you. Question on the human-computer interaction side, let's say. Can you elaborate more on how you can share this data with friends and relatives so that you're not isolated in managing yourself, let's say?
Yeah. So, big question and no one answer. It sort of depends. And again, we should be able to have that micro version of it. So, the example of the whole conversation with Gert, she was at the time like this 7-year-old and still wanting to live very independently, but having a sense of some fragility of her and her friends, and how does she share? So it's that you can have applications that filter, process, and in the way that we use social media now, give people a sense, a processed version of that data. That's different from that. What she was looking for was something that let people have a sense of how someone's doing without that other, just as was mentioned earlier, without somebody coming and saying, I'm not feeling as well, I'm having problems, because these things happen gradually, or we might not want to do it, we might not be cognizant of it, to give somebody else a sense that in the way that when you talk to somebody in your family or a close friend, you can hear it in their voice. So to give that sense, I think there are lots of interesting, and it's all about HCI, in terms of how you do that in ways, and that will just be something that we iterate on and see. With respect to actual health data and sharing, there's lots of good work that's going on in that space around people who are trying to address the coordinated care that happen with family members and informal caregivers around somebody's health data. A little less what I'm talking about here, but there are a number of startups and commercial products in that space.
In the interest of time, we need to wrap up the session right now. So let's thank the speaker again for an inspiring talk. I just have a couple of quick announcements. There's a coffee break right outside, and then there's also the Double Tap posters and demo session that is going on. And to visit them, you should just walk down the hallway to the other end of the building. And then there's a video session that's going to happen right here, right now. And then the joint session for technical papers will take place in that.
Oh, they're showing videos.
You brought one memory, okay.
刚开始我讲的有点慢，后来那个加快了，但是最终是27、8分钟一样。其实这个I remember that I told him